So why do we have so often good reporting, but why does it not actually, over time, improve project outcomes? So we're going to look at just one way of thinking about this, and crucially around how important it is to have decision loops and then make sure that those loops close. So it's just one framework, but it's useful because it helps you to diagnose what's going on, and it's also a useful way to motivate your team to explain actually why you think it's not working. So we've got dashboards, we've got data, we've got all of that, but it hasn't actually sort of raised the tide overall. And so fundamentally, if your last report hasn't actually changed anything, then what's the point? So this is a common experience. So we've got one team that reports status, another team writes the narrative, and then maybe the board or another governance place puts an action in. But in the meantime, you've got the contractor that's still trying to deliver on the prior decision. But by this point, the next report is due. And so the loop doesn't close because the next report obviously doesn't actually take into account this action that's not actually happened. So this is why loops is one useful way of actually sort of framing it, because this is the same situation but seen as a loop. So you can see that there are sort of hand problems, and you can also sort of label that actually there are different levels of organisation involved in the loop. So, you know, there are multiple different things here that actually you could be looking at. Maybe it's too many organisations. Maybe the loop's too short. Many other things. But it's just a place to start and to coordinate thinking about what you might do. So let's start with a really simple loop. So you've got an action, and then you just obviously want to check to see what the effect of your action is. Now, ideally, you want that to feed back into what you do next, so that needs to be a learning. It's not a one-off thing. So now what we do, we did have check here. Why don't we sort of broaden it out to an observation or a set of observations, so that you're not just looking at what the effect is of what you've done, but what the context and the updated context is telling you about the project and about the project environment. So now if you've got time, you'd like to be making a decision, you don't just want to be responding. So now we've got observe, decide, act, and then make sure you go back to observe. Don't just get stuck here, obviously. So again, if we've got a bit more time, what gets us to that point of decision? There's a number of things, right? So I'll just pause a second for the what's the rhetorical question, right? But what's the sort of thing that you would instinctively do? What do you tend to do with your team? So here are some likely answers, right? And you might do all of them, right? So analyze, you might prioritize, sense making, baseline, deductions, you might confer, create options, right? So that's a primitive loop. So now I'll answer this question just from one person, just one particular loop, right? We'll go into a very sort of common, popular loop, which answers a question in a particular way. So many of you will have heard of Boyd, maybe, but for 50 years or so, the OODA loop has been a common loop. And so we built the OODA loop up from a very simple loop. And Boyd answered the question of what do you do before decide with orient or orientate. And the idea there is you take on board the observation, but you understand that observation in the context of the broader project context, but also of what you're seeking to achieve. So the observation doesn't make sense unless you actually understand where you're trying to go and what all the other, how you've been making sense of that project. Now, the crucial thing, and this has been a subject of today as well, is there's always interpretation, always framing with orientation. And orientation seeks to name it rather than kind of push it under the carpet. So actually yesterday, if this is the right slide, I put this in yesterday, yeah. So I had an example of framing yesterday. So I came here yesterday, like many of you, but when I arrived, it looked like this. So I don't know how many of you know this building, but this is the College of Arms. If you go across the Millennium Bridge and then walk up onto Victoria Street, you see this. So I walked in there because obviously I'd misframed it. I thought, I know London. Of course I know where, Armourers Hall is. So College of Arms, is there a conference? No, there's not. So framing, that was a framing problem. So let's look at a project framing example. Again, we're looking at orientation. Okay, so let's say you're going into it and you're thinking mostly about the plan. Are we on plan? What's the status, milestones, all of that kind of thing. Then you'll see it one way. Just remember, this is a case study. So this was a sort of packaging company, a large UK packaging company. And often those were the sort of frames that I observed actually in the management meetings. The other frame that was nudging along, but actually we had to help them name it, was, is it all in the plan? Because there were other things, there was other evidence, there was sort of budgets weren't clear, there were strange things going on in stage gates, and the resource picture was a little bit unusual. So if you're in this frame, you might just conclude things are green. Unsurprisingly to a lot of you, no doubt, you concluded actually that we concluded there were shadow projects, pet projects everywhere. And in this particular case, we tracked it down to the project intake form. So there was a long, very specific form which you had to fill in to get budget, and the result was obviously that a lot of things didn't make it through there. So the things that got through there look great, because already you've got a project manager that's good at filling those sorts of things in. So this is just why orientation is useful. It's just to try and think of what are the different frames we should actually think through, or what frame are we already in before we make a decision. So this is just a loop representation of that same thing. So the problem here is in the Orientate, and basically we're finding that even though we're making these observations, we're filtering them out. So some of these, just labeling these as anti-patterns, because the more anti-patterns that you observe over time, the sort of quicker it is obviously to spot them in future. And also because some of these are meant to be patterns, so I'm just labeling that to make it clear that that's obviously an anti-pattern. Okay, aviation example. Again, a problem with orientation that actually fed back into observation. So again, status was good, but this is quite a simple one, right? There wasn't much project audit going on. There were no project health reports. So unsurprisingly, people could report that status was good. As soon as we started reviewing some of the major programs, things started to change and the position clarified. Okay. Metro example. Okay, so again, actually strangely enough, we had very good project status, but what was happening was that actually a lot of the sort of cross-cutting things that a project would rely on in terms of programs wasn't actually being noticed or recorded. So in other words, there are lots of dependencies and common resources across the projects that meant that obviously they were programs, that actually they were supporting program outcomes. But because they were reporting on the thing that was easy, they were reporting on project status, They weren't reporting really at a program level, and they weren't reporting things like the resource picture. They weren't reporting on dependencies. So actually, from a program perspective, it wasn't going well, but the individual projects were going well. So, I mean, I guess this is just another way of saying orientation. Here's another way of thinking of it is over time, over cycles, start to build your common operating picture so that you can break things out of silos and so that it's not your own, just your own view of actually that project or your typical functions view of that project. So again, use the simple loops, but let's use a slightly more complicated one. This is obviously thermostat is another useful loop with a simple feedback that mostly works, but occasionally it doesn't. Okay, so this is just one way of applying it to a project controls context. So again, you've got the OODA loop: observe, orientate, decide, act. But you've got, again, a focus around baseline, where you can see that maybe your project baseline is actually your project's current theory of itself, is how it understands itself. And obviously that's fed into with data and thinking around actually status. And then your governance is maybe your decision suite, and then maybe that goes into a replan. So, yeah, automotive, the UK luxury car manufacturer. Again, I'm sure many of you have seen this, but we started looking at their KPIs. And again, KPIs were all looking pretty good. But basically, they were just old KPIs that had hung around from previous sort of management teams' emphasis. And so the teams had learned to optimize for those KPIs, and they were just misaligned to what the organization was trying to do. So again, in order to communicate that sort of thing, one way of doing it is to sort of zone in on actually, well, you know, you've got an issue here, and maybe that's again causing a problem backing up in actually what you're observing. So yeah, same company, same portfolio. This was an interesting one. I'd never seen this one before. So, but what we had is at the local level, there was a lot of good data. The projects were reasonably clear, and also at the company level, the management accounting was great. And the company was happy because they could actually report and actually please their shareholders. But there wasn't anything in between that was actually particularly useful. So, you know, obviously there was the usual stuff that departments had, but when programs were making decisions on the projects, the departments were underrepresented because if you like, the data hadn't been aggregated or not enough of the data had been aggregated at the department level. And so therefore, for example, like the capabilities and the resources of the departments were not being clear or being tracked. So they couldn't lobby at sort of program level for their share of resources and their share of focus on their projects. So again, that's not an observation problem because the data was there. It's just stuff was being done well locally and being well done at the top of the organization. But again, an orientation problem that fed into decision problems because again, people weren't actually, you know, departments were getting frustrated because actually they weren't being built into the decisions. There's only a few more of these, honestly. So, aviation, UK major airline. So again, orientation. So on this one, the baseline was very good, also has been very clear. Cost and schedule and risk well represented within that. But benefits, even though there were large programs, there wasn't just projects, obviously, there were large programs. So the benefits of those programs were not included in that baseline that was getting updated every month or so. So what happened is that was one of our diagnostics for actually how governance was actually misfiring. Because, I mean, obviously, all of these are actually pre-Movar, by the way, just I should be clear. These are just prior experience. When we were called in one of my previous companies, they were struggling to make decisions. They were struggling to do their stage gate reviews of programs. And again, their common operating picture was flawed because even though they cared a lot about benefits, you would get programs that were just hanging around because they had the resource, they had the cost, they had the profile, even if their benefits had tailed off because benefits were not being considered. Okay. Telecoms. I'm afraid this was a cost transformation, so people were losing their jobs. Major UK telecoms provider with a global footprint. We were making, there were monthly targets for that cost transformation in sort of pounds value. And those already had been worked out in terms of 4 different roles, number of roles across different types of departments, and everyone had agreed it, all the departments had agreed it. But unsurprisingly, you get to the end of the month, and everyone's low on actually what they'd agreed in terms of actually delivering. So action was not happening. So in this case, what we did is we just had to move to, I mean, initially it was an act of desperation, right? But we just got on the phones every week and we asked individually, we just went down the list and went, right, how many people in this role have you had an initial conversation with? And just went through it like that. And then we realized that that was actually a function that the whole loop was mistimed for us. We needed for a project of this, for a program of this shape, we actually needed a weekly cadence. So we moved to a weekly cadence. So often, if you notice that you start acting more slowly than you expect, or more quickly, it's often because you've intuited, or maybe your team has intuited that actually your cadence is mismatched to actually the pace of change in your environment. So it's a cue to you to put in a more systematic change. So obviously anti-pattern. Okay, so those are 3 simple loops. You can make your own loops, and as you get to know the details of a company, let's go through this. I think this is the last example. So this was a rail example. Major UK infrastructure, 10 minutes, thank you. Major UK infrastructure provider. This was their telecoms department. And what we noticed is that actually actions weren't happening. Again, so that's a bit of a common theme. And the recommendations coming through and the optioneering weren't really supporting at the program level the decisions that the program team needed to make. So there was kind of an authority gap here, and there was a handoff problem here. Now, because of I mean, this was a large department and a large organisation. What we were seeing was that actually we had stuff going on at portfolio level, stuff going on at program level, and stuff going on at project level, and we even had some stuff at the corporate level at what we were seeing as the strategy level, and fundamentally, we couldn't solve this with one loop, because you have to start thinking, obviously, about levels and layers. So what was happening is, with these things here, is you've got a mismatch between the loops. So we had to go one level down. So we still tried to keep the loop simple. So it's just a 3-thing loop, okay? So just look at the loop for a second. Many different ways of doing this, but you had a plan. at the portfolio level, and you were trying to match that with, at a management accounting level, with what was popping out in terms of performance. And then again, this is often the bit that gets missed, is how are we tracking that into actually the people, and how are we supporting the people that are actually delivering that? So you can have a very simple loop, and this is obviously a slow loop. This is essentially a quarterly loop, obviously. But it does give people the structure to then start planning their own loops. Now, often they won't think of them as loops, and you don't need to communicate. Some people won't think in loops. You don't need to communicate with it. But it does help. It's just one way of actually organising your own thinking. So in this case, I wasn't responsible for this one or this one, I think. But I was responsible for sort of discussing with the relevant stakeholders. So I made sure that there were loops, that the ones I was responsible for worked. Again, simple loops. They don't always have to have action in the loop, because some organisations, some parts of organisations, obviously, are sometimes not actually delivering an action. So an example here, this is the management accounting thing. Obviously, they're doing information and analytics and all that kind of thing. But for me, I recommended to them that they think about communication, because that was what was failing in the bigger loop. They were doing all the analysis, but this team wasn't actually then factoring that in. So there's not an action in that, but so it can be whatever you need for the organisation. So you can create your own loops, but try and, like, if you're introducing levels, obviously you just try and do that carefully so as not to confuse people. So I've got to mention AI very briefly in the context of loops. Obviously, lots of project-specific AI is very powerful now, but let's just talk about the ones we all know now already, as, you know, the ChatGPTs and things. A loop view does help you actually assign AI to the right step. 5 minutes. So I'm just going to skip over the AI ones, but they will be in the slides, I think. So I just want to get to the... But basically, AI helps with this, all right? So concluding, okay. We've covered the importance of closing decision loops. This will be an example of a diagnostic. Pick a loop, map a stage, find the break in the loop, name the anti-pattern. One thing you could do to see if this works for you, just look at your last replans and see if you can state the decision that was actually involved, or at least one decision that was involved in each replan. Did the prior reporting lead to change or not? So 5 things. Loops must close. Orientate before you decide. Use the simplest loop you can get away with. Recognize the loops that you already have within your teams and stakeholders, and reuse them where you can. And this is a key one. Match the decision cadence to the pace of project change. So Movar reply, this is what we do. Do contact me at LinkedIn if you like. Dale's here, Rushi's here. Thank you very much. Questions?